Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 16th, 2024. My topic today is going to be how David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission turned the United States into a parasitical empire, which is now verging on collapse. And U.S. foreign policy, as a result of this, is committed to war, to supporting economic policies that are destroying not just the developing sector, but now the so-called advanced sector, and the imposition of green policies that are increasing the rate at which industrialization is being destroyed. If you look at the world today with the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, the civil war in Sudan, the teeing up of a war against China, what you see is that the empire is in a desperate situation, especially desperate because of the upcoming BRICS Summit on October 22nd, which I talked about yesterday. Now, I'm working on an article for the Executive Intelligence Review on Blinken and what we call the collective Biden administration. And this is some of the background to that question of who's running the country. How did someone like Blinken, a mediocrity at best, end up in this position, and where did his policies come from? Now, the reality is this goes back to the founding of an organization, which many of you are familiar with in terms of its name, the Trilateral Commission, which was founded in July 1973. And three of the leading participants in the founding were David Rockefeller, at that time, the CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank. He's now deceased. Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter. And it was the Trilateral Commission that put Jimmy Carter into the White House in 1976. The supposed idea was to achieve a higher level of coordination between Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. The reality is that it was to establish a world government with a commitment to replacing the power of constitutional elected bodies, congresses, parliaments, and so on, with teams of technocrats who worked on behalf of global bankers and corporate cartels rather than the interests of the people in sovereign states that they came from. Now, as of 2021, there were still 400 members in this, so it's not inconsequential. But let me give you the names of some of the founding members and people who became members. George Franklin, who was the executive director for years of the Council on Foreign Relations. Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker, who were both Federal Reserve chairmen. Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the current Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor to Biden. Mark Brzezinski, the son of Zabiggy. Nicholas Burns, who's now the U.S. ambassador to China. Jeffrey Epstein and George H.W. Bush were members. Larry Fink of BlackRock. Samuel Huntington of the Clash of Civilizations fame. Journalists who really are essentially representing the intelligence community. David Ignatius from the Washington Post, Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times, and Andrea Mitchell. Henry Kissinger was a member. Wendy Sherman, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for a number of years, and Keir Starmer. Now, this is the crew that is following up the initial policy initiatives around Volcker and Brzezinski. Now, Volcker was key because he was a promoter of what was called controlled disintegration, which was involved at the center of something called the Project 1980s, which was a trilateral commission project designed to pave the way for a world government, to take sovereignty away from nations, to create a situation where technocrats would run governments on behalf of global banks and global corporate cartels rather than the interests of sovereign nation states. Volcker was at the center of that when he came in as Federal Reserve Chairman. the inflation rate spiked, and Volcker put interest rates up to somewhere over 20 to 24%, supposedly to squeeze out inflation. And what it did is it squeezed out a lot of industry. It was the beginning of the outsourcing of U.S. industrial capability and the establishment of the supply chains coming from China. Now, the other part of this, the foreign policy part, was Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who developed a theme called the Ark of Crisis. And this refers to the nations that existed on the southern border of the Soviet Union. And the Ark of Crisis, in Brzezinski's idea, was that you could create Islamic fundamentalist movements that would have an impact both to the north in terms of disrupting the Soviet Union, but also into the south down to the Indian Ocean. Now, he was a promoter of what was called later Islamic terrorism. And this was done around the whole situation in Afghanistan. That Brzezinski admitted that what triggered the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at the end of 1979, when the Red Army was sent in, was the Carter administration's commitment to arming mujahideen, that is, tribes and Islamic groups inside Afghanistan, to try to drive out Russian influence from the Afghan government. And this continued. And in fact, it was under Brzezinski's watch and then later under George Herbert Walker Bush during the Reagan administration that Al-Qaeda and Taliban came to the fore as the marching armies of the Islamic Guard. Now, in this way, it was a post-Cold War Russophobia that grabbed hold after the fall of the Soviet Union, but was shaped by essentially a merger between what a group that called themselves humanitarian hawks among the Democrats, and this included Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, Samantha Power, Susan Rice, and Blinken and his crowd. And they championed what was called the responsibility to protect, which was a Blairite doctrine, which said that a nation like the United States and the British and NATO had a right to intervene to defend the human rights in any nation. And of course, what they did is carried out regime change, as in the case of Gaddafi in Libya, in Ukraine and elsewhere. Now, these humanitarian hawks merged with the PNAC crowd, the Project for a New American Century, the neocons around Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Dick Cheney, the Kagan family. Robert Kagan was a very prominent figure in this, one of the founders of PNAC, along with William Kristol. These were Republican globalists, and Kagan's wife was is still Victoria Nuland, who was key in the Ukraine process. So if you merge the Brzezinski Cold War faction of humanitarian democratic hawks, as they called themselves, with the PNAC, Bush, Cheney networks, you get a sense of why we're in permanent war. That was their policy. We were in Afghanistan for 40 years. We're still in Iraq. We're in a war in Ukraine where, don't kid yourself, the U.S. is part of that war. And now the situation in Southwest Asia and Gaza, again, you have American input into that at the highest level. Now, this answers the question for you of how it is that Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris, the arch hawk of the Bush crowd of the Iraq War, now working with supposedly a democratic humanitarian. Well, we'll be taking this up today in the dialogue I do with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, but I want to read you a few quotes from Brzezinski here, from his book, The Grand Chessboard, which gives you a sense of what he was thinking. The defeat and collapse of the Soviet Union was the final step in the rapid ascendance of a Western Hemisphere power, the United States, as the sole and indeed the first truly global power. And then he added, and this is key, it is imperative that no Eurasian challenger emerges capable of dominating Eurasia and thus also of challenging America. Now, you've no doubt heard that Putin's initiatives have been to create a Eurasian alliance in which Russia is the link between Europe and Eurasia. This is what the British always intended to prevent. And so Brzezinski is reiterating the policies that come from Halford Mackinder from the beginning of the 20th century, but based on this idea that the United States, as the sole superpower, no longer the British Empire, but the US, must make sure there's no threat from any other alliance. And that's why the BRICS is being targeted and why Russia and China are being targeted by the US and NATO. Now, in the Ukraine question, this had to do with the expansion of NATO. And Brzezinski said, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. Russia, without Ukraine, can still strive for imperial status, but it would then become a predominantly Asian imperial state. If Moscow regains control over Ukraine, with its 52 million people and major resources, as well as access to the Black Sea, Russia automatically regains the wherewithal to become a powerful imperial state, spanning Europe and Asia. And that's what must be prevented. That's the Brzezinski view. This is just a couple of quotes. I'll be writing this up in a couple of days. Hopefully it'll be in the next EIR. But I wanted to give you a foretaste of it, to give you a sense of what we face now as we battle to defend the idea of the BRICS for a new development architecture and a new security architecture. And be sure to tune in today at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for my discussion with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. If you can't get there live, it will be archived. So thanks for joining us today. Stay with us. We're in the midst of a fight which we have to win.